America's most famous sports car, nearly died before it turned 2 years old. Because the story of these 8 generations isn't the story of a car that always won. It's the story of a car that almost got canceled, that had its horsepower gutted by law, and that spent 60 years chasing one single idea its own engineer dreamed up back in the 1960s. When they finally pulled it off, they rewrote the rules for good, and you're going to see exactly how. I've gone through all 8 generations, every engine and every special edition, from the first straight six in 1953 to today's twin-turbo monster making over 1,000 horsepower. Here's what's at stake: how a 150 horsepower car that almost nobody wanted became a mid-engine missile making over 1,000 horsepower, because everyone just assumes the Corvette was always king. But in 1955, Chevrolet sold only around 700 of them, and came within an inch of throwing the whole thing in the trash for good. The first Corvette was gorgeous on the outside and a fraud underneath. Chevrolet unveiled it at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, promising the future, and exactly 300 rolled out that first year, every single one painted the same polo white, every one identical. The problem was under the hood, because that Corvette didn't hide the heart of a sports car. It had a 150 horsepower Blue Flame straight six pulled from a family sedan, bolted to a 2-speed Powerglide automatic built for grocery runs. A European sports car would embarrass it at a stoplight, so sales cratered. In 1955, Chevrolet sold only about 700 units, and Ford had just launched the Thunderbird, which was walking all over it. The Corvette was one signature away from disappearing forever. But here's the man who saved it. Zora Arkus Duntov was a Belgian-Russian engineer, a racing driver, obsessed with speed, and when he saw that lazy six-cylinder, he knew exactly what it needed: a V8. In 1955, the 265 cubic inch small block arrived with 195 horsepower, and the Corvette stopped being a pretty toy and turned into a real threat. And then, in 1957, it made history. That year, the Corvette got mechanical fuel injection on a 283 cubic inch V8, and Chevrolet announced a magic number: 283 horsepower. 1 horsepower for every cubic inch. Now, it's worth saying this carefully, because the experts agree that 1 horse per cubic inch was as much a marketing slogan as an engineering feat, and some argue the real output was closer to 290. But the message landed. The Corvette was playing in the big leagues now. On the track, the change was just as dramatic. The first C1 did 0 to 60 in a sluggish 11.5 seconds. The 1962 car, with its 327 V8 making 360 horsepower, dropped that to 5.9 seconds, and it was the first Corvette to cross the quarter mile at over 100 miles per hour. Even an astronaut fell for it. Wally Schirra of the Mercury program drove one. In 10 years, the Corvette went from dying to iconic. But right when it found its identity, a designer and an engineer declared war over a single window. The war wasn't over the engine. It was over a bar of metal running down the middle of the rear glass. When the new Corvette Stingray arrived in 1963, it carried an idea that split Chevrolet into 2 camps. Head of design, Bill Mitchell wanted a vertical spine, dividing the coupe's rear window in 2, the famous split window. He thought it was a work of art, but Zora Arkus Duntov, the engineer, hated it, because it blocked the driver's rear view and was a hazard. Mitchell got his way, but only for 1 year. So the split window existed only in 1963, and today that 1-year-only car is the single most coveted Corvette of the entire era. Underneath that fight, though, was real engineering. The Stingray introduced the first independent rear suspension in Corvette history, and finally the car gripped the road as well as it ran in a straight line. The design came from a shark. Bill Mitchell had become obsessed with a mako he'd caught, and his team, led by Larry Shinoda, translated that sharp shape into sheet metal. But the Europeans kept nipping at its heels, so Chevrolet answered with muscle. In 1965 came the first big block, a 396 making 425 horsepower. A year later, the 427, and in 1967 the ultimate beast appeared, the L88. Here's where we have to tread carefully, because this one's legend. Chevrolet officially rated the L88 at 430 horsepower, a number that was deliberately, absurdly low. With its 12.5 to 1 compression, aluminum heads, and giant carburetor, the most cited estimates put the real figure around 560 horsepower. Why lie low? To keep it off the insurance company's radar and in the hands of racers. Barely 24 were built. It's one of the most valuable Corvettes in existence. By the numbers, the leap was enormous. The fuel-injected Stingray did 0 to 60 in 5.8 seconds, and the L88 dipped under 13.5 seconds in the quarter mile, race car figures with a license plate. In 5 years, the Corvette went from pretty to fearsome. But right as horsepower hit the sky, a law arrived that nearly killed American muscle altogether. The best-selling Corvette of its era was also the one that lost more horsepower than any other in history. The new C3 arrived in 1968 with a body that stole your breath, Coke bottle curves, muscular fenders, and hidden headlights, all inspired by the Mako Shark 2 concept. From the outside, it looked faster than ever, and for the first few years it was. In 1970, the Corvette hit its muscle peak with a massive 454 cubic inch big block making 425 horsepower. It was the summit of a golden era. But that summit was also the start of the fall, because from there, 3 enemies struck at once. First, the new EPA emissions regulations forced engines to be choked down. Then the 1973 oil crisis sent gas prices through the roof and turned gas guzzlers into outcasts. And finally, insurance companies started punishing powerful cars with impossible premiums. So the horsepower evaporated. The numbers are scary. In 1970, a top Corvette made 425 horsepower. By 1975, the base engine had fallen to around 165 horsepower, the weakest Corvette ever built. The same car that once flew through the quarter mile now crawled from 0 to 60 in over 10 seconds. The bodywork promised war. The engine begged forgiveness. And yet people bought it like never before. Here's the great paradox of the C3. Despite losing power, it was a massive sales success. Over its 15-year lifespan, more than 500,000 were built, the most produced generation up to that point. People weren't buying the Corvette for what it did anymore, they were buying it for how it looked. It was a bedroom poster on wheels. Chevrolet knew it, and played that card. In 1978, for the 25th anniversary, the Corvette was the official pace car of the Indianapolis 500, and it got a commemorative edition people bought just to lock away and never drive. And in 1982, the last C3 said goodbye with the collector edition and one key novelty, the return of fuel injection called Crossfire, pointing toward the future. The C3 survived the worst decade in the history of American performance by selling style while it waited for better days. And those days came with a total redesign, one preceded by the strangest year in the entire saga, the year the Corvette simply didn't exist. There is a 1983 Corvette you could never buy because officially it never existed. The story is real. Chevrolet had the Corvette's total redesign lined up for the 1983 model year, but quality problems and new emission standards pushed everything back again and again. So a handful of prototypes were built, around 24, and then the order came down to destroy them all. Exactly one survived, and it is on display today at the Corvette Museum. The car jumped straight from 1982 to 1984, and 1983 remained a ghost in the brand's history. When it finally arrived, the C4 was another planet. It was modern, aerodynamic, sharp-edged, and it debuted something that looked straight out of a spaceship, a fully digital dashboard, with LCD screens instead of needles. In 1984, that was the future. But under the skin, the first C4 still was not a beast. Its 205 horsepower came up short, and Japanese rivals like the Nissan 300X and the Mazda RX-7 were starting to close in. The Corvette needed something to put it back on top, and in 1990, it got it. It was called the ZR1, and under the hood it hid a European secret. Chevrolet commissioned Lotus, yes, the British, to design a completely new engine, the LT5, a V8 with dual overhead cams and 32 valves. It started at 375 horsepower and later climbed to 405 horsepower, a brutal figure for the time. The press crowned it the king of the hill. It was so far beyond the regular Corvette that it cost nearly double, and it could humiliate supercars worth 3 times as much. The numbers backed it up. The ZR1 did 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 5.2 seconds and brushed 180 miles per hour Ferrari territory at Chevrolet prices. The C4 went out in style. In 1996, its final year, it launched the Grand Sport, painted in a deep admiral blue with a central white stripe and 2 red hash marks on the fender, just 1,000 units, a tribute to the Grand Sport racers of the 1960s. The C4 gave the Corvette back its technology and its pride. But while it celebrated, a silent war was raging inside General Motors, one that nearly canceled the next generation before it was ever born. The 1997 Corvette almost never happened, and it was designed practically in secret while General Motors was falling apart. In the early 90s, General Motors was in a brutal financial crisis, and an expensive niche sports car like the Corvette was exactly the kind of project a board of directors cancels without blinking. So the development team worked on slashed budgets and kept a low profile, fighting internally to keep the program alive. That the C5 was even born was already a win, and when it was born, it changed everything from the ground up. Because the C5 was not a touch-up, it was a reinvention of the architecture. It introduced a hydroform chassis that was far stiffer and, above all, moved the transmission to the rear axle, joining it to the differential in a single unit called a transaxle. The result? Nearly perfect weight distribution between the 2 axles. And finally a Corvette that behaved in the corners like the Europeans, not just in a straight line. Under the hood, it debuted another legend, the LS1 engine. This 5.7-liter aluminum V8, making 345 horsepower, would go on to become one of the most beloved and most modified engines in American automotive history. It was light, reliable, and had almost limitless potential. The base C5 already did 0 to 60 in about 5.4 seconds. Those figures, years earlier, demanded a huge big block. But Chevrolet was not satisfied, and in 2001 it revived a sacred name. The Z06 was back, gone since the 60s. With its LS6 engine, first 385, then 405 horsepower, it was the sharpest Corvette in decades, capable of dipping under 4.7 seconds to 60. It was not the most luxurious. It was the fastest and the purest. And then the Corvette did something it had not done seriously in decades. It started winning again. The C5R racing program took the Corvette back to the 24 hours of Le Mans, and in 2004 it grabbed the win in the GT1 class, humiliating European brands on their own turf. The C5 saved the Corvette from cancellation and turned it into a world-class sports car. But the next generation had an even bigger ambition, not just to compete with Ferrari and Porsche, but to embarrass them at half the price. This was the Corvette that stood right in front of Ferrari and Porsche and offered 90% of their performance for half their price. The C6 arrived in 2005 with a change purists had been waiting on for more than 40 years. For the first time since 1962, the Corvette ditched the hidden headlights and ran exposed fixed units. It sounds like a minor detail, but it was a statement of intent. This car didn't want to hide anymore. It wanted to look the best in the world, dead in the eye. It was smaller, lighter, and sharper than the C5. But the important part was, as always, under the hood. The base model already started at 400 horsepower, and from 2008 it climbed to a 6.2-liter V8, making 430. The real story of the C6, though, is its two monsters. The first landed in 2006, reviving the Z06 name yet again. This Z06 hid the LS7, a naturally aspirated 7-liter V8, 427 cubic inches, a direct nod to the classic big blocks that made 505 horsepower and revved like a race engine. It did 0 to 60 in about 4.2 seconds, and for years was considered one of the best driver's cars money could buy in America. But Chevrolet still had an ace up its sleeve, and in 2009 it played it. It was called the ZR1, and its internal code name says it all. Blue Devil. Under its hood, with a clear window to show it off, beat the LS9, a 6.2-liter V8 with a supercharger cranking out 638 horsepower. It was the first Corvette in history to break 600 horsepower, and also the first to cross the 200 miles per hour barrier. It did 0 to 60 in a savage 3.7 seconds. And here's the part that infuriated Europe. The ZR1 performed like an Italian supercar costing 3 times as much. An American-built Corvette out of a plant in Kentucky, going toe-to-toe with Ferrari and Porsche on raw numbers for a fraction of the money. On the track, history repeated. In 2008, the Corvette took a class win at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, proving the speed wasn't just brochure talk. The C6 turned the Corvette into a full-blown supercar hunter, but the next generation hid a bittersweet secret. It would be the last to carry the engine where the Corvette had always kept it. The C7 was a goodbye disguised as a celebration, the last Corvette that would carry its engine where it always had, in front of the driver. When it arrived in 2014, Chevrolet brought back a name loaded with history and stamped it on the trunk again, Stingray. They hadn't used it since the 70s, and it was no accident. The C7 wanted to reconcile the Corvette with its most glorious past while shoving it into the future with an angular, aggressive design full of sharp edges and functional air ducts. From the outside, it looked angry. On the inside, at last, it left behind the cheap interiors the press had been ripping for decades. Under the hood, it debuted the LT1 engine, a 6.2-liter V8 making about 460 horsepower with direct injection, capable of something that used to seem impossible in a Corvette, being fast and reasonably efficient at the same time. The base Stingray did 0 to 60 in about 4 seconds, figures that a decade earlier demanded the most extreme version. But, as always, the hardcore versions were the ones that made history. In 2015 came the Z06, and this time it broke with the naturally aspirated tradition. It ran the LT4, a 6.2-liter with a supercharger making 650 horsepower. It was devastating, so brutal that on the track, plenty of drivers complained it overheated from pushing so hard. So Chevrolet had to cap the generation with something even wilder. And in 2019 it unleashed its final masterpiece, the ZR1. This ZR1 debuted the LT5, a 6.2-liter with an enormous supercharger, producing the highest figure ever seen in a front-engine Corvette, 755 horsepower. It did 0 to 60 in about 3.4 seconds, and topped 210 miles per hour. It was the absolute period at the end of a 66-year era. Never again would a Corvette carry its V8 in front of the driver, because while the ZR1 was breaking records, an unstoppable rumor was already running through the car world. Chevrolet's engineers had been spotted testing camouflage prototypes with a very strange silhouette, the cabin pushed way forward, and a suspicious bulge right behind the seats. The dream one engineer had had 60 years earlier was about to come true, and when it did, the Corvette would never be the same again. The engine finally goes in the back, and with that, the Corvette fulfilled a 60-year dream that started with the man who saved it back in the 50s. Zora Arkus Duntov, the engineer who dropped the first V8 into the Corvette, had been convinced of one thing since the 1960s. To truly compete with the best in the world, the Corvette needed its engine in the middle, behind the driver, like the Ferraris and Lamborghinis of racing. He built secret prototypes to prove it. But time and again, for more than half a century, General Motors' costs and caution killed the idea. Duntov died in 1996 without ever seeing it happen. So, when the C8 debuted in 2020 with its V8 planted behind the seats, it was not just a new car, it was a promise kept decades late. And the most incredible part was the price of that revolution. The C8 Stingray introduced the LT2, a naturally aspirated 6.2-liter V8 making 495 horsepower, mounted in the middle. With that layout, the weight sat over the rear axle and traction went through the roof. The result, 0 to 60 in about 2.9 seconds, $300,000 supercar figures in a car that started at a fraction of that money. The press couldn't believe it, but that was just the beginning, because then came the beasts. In 2023, the Z06 appeared, and its heart was an engineering jewel. The LT6, a 5.5-liter V8 with a flat plane crank that spun to 8,600 revolutions per minute and made 670 horsepower. It is recognized as the most powerful naturally aspirated production V8 ever built, and it sounds like a Formula One car. Then came the E-Ray, the first hybrid Corvette, and the first with all-wheel drive, pairing the V8 with a front electric motor for a total of 655 horsepower. And then, in 2025, Chevrolet shattered the mythical ceiling. It was called the ZR1 once again, and it debuted the LT7, a twin-turbo version of the flat-plane engine producing a number that for decades belonged only to seven-figure European hypercars, 1,064 horsepower. It's the first Corvette over 1,000 horsepower, capable of topping 215 miles per hour, a car built in Kentucky, rubbing shoulders with Bugatti and Koenigsegg. From a 150 horsepower convertible almost nobody wanted, to a mid-engine missile making over 1,000 that humbles hypercars. In 72 years, the Corvette didn't just survive, it won. Think about that for a second. The same car Chevrolet nearly threw in the trash in 1955 now builds the most powerful naturally aspirated V8 in the world and cracks 1,000 horsepower. No other sports car has survived 8 straight generations without changing its name even once. But there's an American vehicle that's held on even longer, that sold far, far more units, and that fought its own war to survive by completely changing shape. It's not a sports car, it's the truck that built America, and its story is even wilder. Find out right here